They said her wedding veil was white, but behind it was the darkest story the South had ever buried. A girl, barely grown, standing in front of the altar, her trembling hands folded into those of the man who had raised her, not as a stranger, not as a protector, but as her groom. It was whispered in hushed tones in the church pews, though no one dared speak aloud. A daughter, given away not to a husband, but back into the arms of her father. Some called it sin, some called it madness, but for the family who lived hidden in the hills, it was neither. To them, it was simply tradition. This was not a fairy tale of forbidden love. It was a tale born from centuries of isolation, where the boundaries of family blurred until bloodlines twisted in on themselves. The people of the town, if they spoke of it at all, would lower their voices and cast their eyes to the ground. They had seen the children who came from such unions, the bodies frail, the eyes vacant, the whispers of madness carried on. Yet in a world forgotten by progress, this family believed they were keeping something pure alive. Her name has been lost in the fog of history, preserved only in fragments of courthouse records and whispered legends that survive in the South's darkest corners. But the fragments are enough to piece together the horror of a young bride whose life was decided before she ever had a chance to claim it. The photographs that remain show a girl with a face too old for her years, her eyes heavy with something no child should carry. A secret she could never speak, but one that weighed on her with every breath. The marriage was not only the breaking of sacred law, but also a sealing of fate. It locked her in a cycle her bloodline had carried for generations, a cycle where father became husband, where daughter became wife, where children were born already bearing the sins of their family tree. And yet, in the quiet of the countryside, there were no riots, no justice, no rescue, only silence, and the slow decay of a family trapped in their own making. What unfolded in that house is almost unspeakable, but it is part of America's hidden history. A history many would rather forget. The day of the wedding arrived like a funeral disguised in lace. The church was small, its white paint peeling, its pews filled with faces too frightened to acknowledge what they were witnessing. They sat in silence, their hands folded, their eyes fixed anywhere but the altar. The bride walked down the aisle in a dress that had been passed down, a hand-me-down relic of other unions no one dared speak of. Her steps were slow, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Every movement seemed forced, as though her body understood the weight of what her mind could not refuse. At the altar stood her father, dressed in black, his expression stern and unyielding. There was no shame in his posture, no hesitation. To him, this was not a scandal. It was a claim, his claim. The preacher's voice trembled as he recited the vows, yet he spoke them anyway, as though compelled by fear or by a loyalty stronger than conscience. The congregation bowed their heads, not in prayer, but in complicity. Every bowed head was a silent agreement to let the unspeakable happen. The girl's hand shook as he slipped the ring on her finger. It was not the trembling of excitement, but of surrender. She said the words she was told to say, her voice quiet, almost inaudible, but loud enough to seal her fate. A kiss upon the altar, a father's lips pressed against his daughter's, and with it, an entire town's silence became her prison. What followed was not a life of love, but of confinement. She lived in that house as both daughter and wife, roles twisted into something unnatural. Her childhood erased the moment the vows were spoken. Neighbors saw her less and less, her figure retreating into the shadows of her home. Some whispered they could hear her crying through the thin wooden walls on quiet nights, though no one ever stepped forward to intervene. Others insisted she never cried at all, that her silence was complete, as though her voice had been taken from her along with her freedom. Years passed and the union bore children born not into innocence, but into the heavy inheritance of their family's choices. They carried the features of their father and grandfather, because in truth, they were both, and the cycle wound tighter still, binding another generation into a pattern that had already claimed too many lives. This was no longer just one girl's tragedy. It was the living evidence of what happens when a family's secrets are left to rot in silence. The story begins not with the wedding itself, but with the soil these people lived on. Red clay earth, poor for farming, rich only in the weight of its isolation. Deep in the south, there were pockets of land where families became their own world. Roads rarely reached them, and strangers even less. The outside called them backwoods or hill folk, but to themselves they were simply surviving. And in that survival, the line between kinship and marriage began to blur. Generations before the bride ever put on her veil, her ancestors had already built the pattern. Cousins marrying cousins, brothers taking sisters as wives, and in time, fathers laying claim to daughters. It was a secret hidden in plain sight. The law written on paper meant little when there was no one around to enforce it. No sheriff dared march up those dirt paths. No preacher spoke against it, because too often the preacher was kin to the ones committing the act. The family itself was caught in a strange belief. Some said they thought they were keeping their bloodline pure, untouched by outsiders who they believed would corrupt them. Others suggest it was less belief and more desperation. Too few choices in an isolated world where neighbors were nothing more than cousins by another name. Whatever the reason, by the time our bride was born, her life was already carved in stone. She wasn't born free, she was born an heir to a cycle no one dared break. By the time she was a child, whispers were already following her. The neighbors, the few who lived close enough to see, would shake their heads when they passed by her family's house. They saw how her father watched her, not with the stern protectiveness of a parent, but with an unsettling claim, as though she had been promised before she could even speak. And her mother, silent, withdrawn, seemed more like a ghost haunting the house than a live-it. Young woman, some say the mother herself had once been in the same position, married young to her own kin, trapped in a loop that spun from one generation to the next. By adolescence, the girl's fate was sealed. There would be no suitors, no young men from neighboring towns. She belonged to the man who had given her life. In her world there was no escape because there was no alternative. And so, the date of the wedding was chosen, not in joy, but in inevitability, a family's curse, written into law with vows spoken before God. By the middle years of her life, the bride had become almost a ghost within her own home. She was still young, yet her eyes carried the same emptiness as the weathered women who had come before her. Neighbors said she rarely spoke above a whisper, as if her very voice had been trained into silence. Her children clung to her skirts, many of them weak, sickly, and marked by the unmistakable signs of a bloodline folding in on itself. To outsiders, they were a living testimony to sins no one wanted to confront. But the town did not speak. They lived beside the family, nodding politely at church, exchanging glances on dirt roads, but never daring to interfere. In many ways, it was easier to let the story rot behind closed doors than to expose it to the light. That silence became the greatest shield the family had. Silence from neighbors, silence from law, silence from God himself. The bride's father aged into grey, but his grip over the household never weakened. He saw his children not as sons and daughters, but as extensions of himself, possessions bound by blood. Some whispered that when his own daughters reached adolescence, he looked at them the same way he had once looked at their mother. The horror was generational, repeating itself with a cruelty that felt less like chance and more like destiny. And here is where we confront the question that lingers like a wound. Why did no one stop it? Why did the town, the church, the law, all look away? Perhaps it was because to acknowledge it meant acknowledging that such darkness could exist within their own community. Perhaps it was fear of violence, or perhaps it was resignation, the belief that this family was beyond saving. Whatever the reason, silence became the soil in which this nightmare grew. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because to sit with this story, to let it unfold, is to walk through a graveyard of secrets most would rather leave buried. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken out, or would you, like the others, have stayed silent? Because history tells us this, Silence was the choice most made, and that silence became the coffin for generations who never had a voice of their own. The children who came from that union were marked before they even drew their first breath. Their bodies bore the weight of the bloodline's collapse, crooked spines, sunken eyes, skin too pale for the southern sun. Some were born with twisted limbs, others with minds that never fully formed. Neighbors whispered the word cursed, though they never spoke it within earshot of the family. It was as if the land itself had turned against them, punishing generation after generation for a sin that would not end. The bride, now a mother, moved through life as a shadow. Those who caught glimpses of her described a woman whose spirit had been drained, her face lined with exhaustion far beyond her years. She tended to her children with the same quiet submission she had given her father-husband, as though her own will had been buried the day she walked down that aisle. The home became a place of silence, its walls heavy with secrets no one dared to put into words. But the silence outside the home was heavier still. In the town, everyone knew. They knew when the children stumbled through the dirt roads, their eyes unfocused, their bodies frail. They knew when the girl-turned wife appeared at church with her father beside her, their rings glinting beneath the dim light. And yet, no one acted. Perhaps it was fear. Fear of retribution, fear of being cast out, fear of acknowledging that such horror was festering within their own community. Or perhaps it was apathy, the kind born from generations of poverty and isolation where survival outweighed morality. Still, the family did not stop. The father, aging but unyielding, saw no crime in what he had done. To him it was his right, his legacy, and his will passed on to the next. His children grew, and some were kept close, bound to repeat the cycle, while others slipped away into obscurity. The lines between father, brother, husband, and son became blurred beyond recognition, until the family tree was less a branching oak and more a tangled knot, strangling itself with every generation. The bride's story became a cautionary tale, whispered among those brave enough to admit it. Her life, stripped of choice, became an echo of the lives before her and the lives after. And as the years wore on, the family became a symbol of what happens when silence becomes complicity, when the community looks away, and when bloodlines are left to devour themselves in the shadows of forgotten America. Time has a way of erasing names, but not erasing scars. The family's story, though hidden from official record books, seeped into the folklore of the region. Locals would whisper of the house on the ridge, where the father married his daughter, and where their children bore the marks of that forbidden union. The bride herself faded into legend. Some say she died young, worn down by sickness and sorrow, while others insist she lived on into old age, her face hardened into stone, a permanent reminder of what happens when a woman is denied her own life. The children who survived carried the curse forward. Some of them left the ridge, disappearing into towns and cities, their pasts never spoken of, their bloodlines silently branching into unsuspecting communities. Others stayed, bound to the same land, repeating the same cycles until the family tree grew so tangled that no one could untie it. And though the original bride's name has been forgotten, her existence still breathes in the bones of those who walk the South today. But the horror of this story is not just in what happened behind one family's walls. It lies in the silence of everyone who knew. The preacher who spoke the vows, the congregation who bowed their heads, the neighbors who heard the cries at night, all of them became accomplices, not by action, but by inaction. It was their silence that allowed the family to sink deeper into its own undoing, their refusal to face the horror that stood in plain sight. And this is the haunting truth of hidden history. For every story like this one that we uncover, there are countless others that remain buried. Families whose names were never written down, whose children never survived to tell the tale, whose houses rotted away until the earth itself swallowed them whole. Yet their ghosts remain, in the rumors that still ripple through southern towns, in the old photographs no one dares display, in the bloodlines that carry secrets most will never know they inherit. The South has always been a land of beauty and brutality, but within its hills lie stories too dark for most to face. And this bride, the one who became both daughter and wife, victim and mother, is a reminder of how close those shadows really are. In the end, the bride's story was never just her own. It was the story of a family devouring itself, of a community that chose silence over truth, and of a land that buried its sins beneath the soil until they festered. She was a girl who should have had a choice, a voice, a future. Instead, she was written into a role carved by generations before her, a role of obedience, submission, and suffering. Her tragedy is not preserved in marble statues or history books. It lives only in whispers, in courthouse records yellowed with time, and in the unease that still lingers when her tale is spoken aloud. What makes this story unbearable is not only what happened to her, but how familiar it is. Hidden families, closed-off communities, cycles of abuse that repeat under the guise of tradition. These are not relics of the past. They are shadows that still haunt the present. For every bride who walked to the altar with her father at her side, there are countless others who suffered in silence, their names forgotten, but their pain echoing forward. The South's most inbred bride who married her father may seem like an unspeakable anomaly, a grotesque footnote in America's hidden history, but she is not alone. She is part of a pattern, a dark undercurrent of human history, where isolation breeds secrecy, and secrecy breeds horrors too great to face. And while her name may be lost, her story remains not as a curiosity, but as a warning. Because silence is what allows nightmares to grow. It is what allows generations to suffer before a single voice dares to break free. And so, when we remember her, we are forced to ask ourselves, how many other stories like hers were erased? How many brides walked the same path, their lives consumed by the very bloodlines meant to protect them? The South is full of ghosts, but some of the most terrifying do not haunt cemeteries. They haunt family.